welcome everybody to our last panel of today. My name is Tom Delianis from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And I'm delighted to have a really interesting, diverse group of panelists for us today that are going to be exploring issues around civil-military cooperation in climate-related emergencies. I'll just briefly introduce our speakers and then we'll launch in. We're going to have a slightly different format for this session. We're going to have each speaker speak for about 6 minutes or so, and then I will ask a few questions of each speaker back and forth in a bit more of a dynamic format, and we'll end off with a general Q&A for everybody else. So first, I'd like to welcome Alexandrine Bisaillon, who holds a bachelor's degree in urban planning as well as a master's degree in environment and sustainable development from the University of Montreal. Alexandrine is part of Uranos. I guess you would describe Uranos as a non-governmental organization, Alexandrine, based in Montreal. And she joined the Uranos team in 2016 as a specialist in risk management and resilience, where she collaborated on the development of tools to support adaptation in the municipal environment. Since 2018, she's been coordinating Uranos' support to the governmental InfoCRU project, which intends to integrate climate change in flood mapping for Quebec rivers, and more recently, coordinating the adaptation research program on extreme events. I'd also like to welcome Jessica Alcott Ilmo, as you've pronounced that precisely as a Swede would. I don't think I did a good job. Jessica is the Director, Climate Security Program at the American Security Project, and has worked across the United States in various interagency and of course, internationally for more than 15 years. She's a subject matter expert in climate security, international disaster response, emergency preparedness, and security cooperation programs, and also serves as a senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analysis. As well, I'd like to welcome Ashley Moran, who is a research scientist and lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Government, and who is also research director for the Comparative Constitutions Project. Ashley co-directs the University of Texas's Embedded Scholars Program, and is a co-PI on a U.S. National Science Foundation funded project on concept integration in comparative law. Welcome, Ashley. Oh, and there's a couple other things I want to say about Ashley, sorry about that. Her current research and teaching focus on constitutional development in divided societies, court elaboration of new constitutions, state identity and legitimacy, and conflict risks to democracy. She's a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, or GMAC as we call it, a board member for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, and a member of NDI's Democracy Assistance in Transition Working Group. She also has a PhD in government from the University of Texas. Next to me is Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Virk, who joined the Canadian Armed Forces Primary Reserves in 2001 as an armored reconnaissance officer. He's held various positions throughout his service and is currently the commanding officer of the British Columbia Regiment, Duke of Connaught's Own, which is an armored cavalry and CIMIC regiment in Vancouver, British Columbia. Lieutenant Colonel Virk has supported domestic operations on 3 occasions as the Domestic Response Company Commander with Operation Lentus in 2018, in the fight against the British Columbia wildfires, with Operation Laser in 2020 as part of the CAF pandemic response, and most recently in 2023 as Op Lentus 23-08 Land Task Force Commander for wildfire fighting efforts in British Columbia. As well, I'd like to welcome Libby Dresser, who is a current graduate student in the International Public Policy Program at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Ontario. Libby graduated with honors in the International Bachelor of Arts Program in Political Science from York University in Ontario in 2020. Following her undergraduate degree, Libby obtained a Bachelor in Education degree from Nipissing University in Ontario in 2022, where she developed a passion for children's education and education policy. And last but not least, Rebecca Lloyd, who is a current master's student at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo through the University of Waterloo. Originally from the UK, Rebecca relocated to Canada in 2012 and is a graduate of Carleton University with an honors bachelor in global and international studies. Rebecca has a passion for migration, international relations, and security issues. Welcome to all of you today. I'd like to start first with Ashley, and then we'll go on to Jessica, then Rebecca and Libby, Lieutenant Colonel Verk, and lastly, Alexandrine.
Hi, everybody. Well, I want to start by saying thank you so much to Bruno and to Tom for inviting me to join you all here, and to Tom for organizing this panel and navigating this with us. Okay, so I want to talk with you all today about a project that we've just started. It's a consortium of 5 organizations starting this project that's focused on bringing together more systematic information on the military's involvement in climate-related emergencies, and collecting particularly comparative cross-national data on the military's involvement. And we have a particular focus on NATO countries and partners and other countries that have either very high climate exposure or high military involvement in climate emergencies. And we're very fortunate to have been able to launch the project with initial funding from the Canadian Department of National Defense. And our 5 partners are listed here as CSAC, the NATO Center of Excellence focused on crisis management and disaster response in Bulgaria, EDRC, FOGS, and GMAC. So we are able to draw on academic, civic, military, government partners to be collecting this systematic data. So our research focus, pushing the wrong thing. So our research focus is really on, as I said, trying to collect very systematic cross-national data on the levels of military involvement, patterns and trends in that involvement in climate-related emergencies, and also the legal and funding frameworks guiding the military's role in climate emergencies. And we are looking at both domestic and cross-border assistance and training and cooperation, really aiming to pull together the advantages and drawbacks of assignment of various tasks between military and civilian agencies, good practices. There are 2 core research products that I want to talk with you all about today. The first are, we're putting together a set of country profiles, and initial analyses of these already reveal very stark differences in the way that countries structure their legal and policy frameworks, from perhaps only having a general national disaster plan to countries that have military policies that focus on very specific tasks that are applicable in civil protection, like firefighting, for example, to countries that have very extensive integrated frameworks linking laws and regulations, interagency agreements, military policies. So we're really aiming to disentangle those and identify the range of approaches across countries. We're also seeing a range of military approaches to how they engage the military and civil protection activities, from standalone military units that are dedicated only to civil protection to dual-use units, as they have in Brazil, for example, that are trained specifically to respond to in civil protection, but are also engaged in general military missions, to, of course, specialized personnel within regular units, to full force training. So it really runs the range. And we're also identifying similarities and variations in which kinds of tasks are assigned to military versus civilian agencies, overlaps in those tasks, the scope of tasks for the militaries domestically versus in cross-national assistance. And I should say we're maybe about midway through this. So we have, I think, 13 or so country profiles done already, and we're collecting more. So I'll talk with you all about that a little bit. And our second core research project is a cross-national data set of the military's involvement in climate-related emergencies. And it aims to provide comprehensive coverage of countries that are included within the data set. So all, hopefully, of their responses within their borders and cross-border assistance, but it also aims to provide comparative data across countries by using data from the governments and militaries themselves to really be collecting this data systematically and in a very uniform way. So I'll provide you with one example of the kind of analysis we're doing within countries using the United States. And so this shows US military responses here to domestic emergencies over the last 12 years, with the number of military responses to climate disasters shown in varied colors by hazard type. The dark blue, looks more sort of medium blue on this slide here, is cyclones, orange is floods, green wildfires, and then the number of responses to non-climate related disasters in brown, but it sort of looks like reddish brown here. So we can see that tropical cyclones are really the most common type of disaster that the US military is engaged in within its borders, engaging in over 2,500 responses to typhoons alone within the United States in the last 12 years. And we also see that the cost of those military responses largely tracks with the number of responses that we're seeing. So the dotted lines shown there, the dashed lines, are the the cost of climate-related events. The dotted line is the cost of non-climate-related events. And you can see a spike in military responses to climate disasters in 2017 when the US had $16 billion disasters within that year. And then a spike in non-climate related responses by the military in 2020 and 21 with COVID. But otherwise, domestic military responses, these data show, are largely focused on climate related events within US borders at least. And then we also see a slight uptick in military responses domestically to climate related disasters since 2019. I'll just make one note here. This adds in US military responses to foreign emergencies as well, and we see it really doesn't change the picture very much. In this slide, the tan, light brown color is all domestic military responses, and the dark brown is all foreign the dark brown is non-climate related responses, and all the foreign responses are only in green. So we see this really reinforces that the US military is primarily engaged within its borders in both climate and non-climate responses. I'll have one quick look globally just to provide a little bit of an example of what we're trying to do with this cross-border analysis. We initially tried to collect these data through international organizations. One of the most standardized sources for tracking aid flows is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, but only some countries report to the OECD, and they only report their aid for developing countries. So this is not yet a fully complete data set, but of the 50 countries that do report to the OECD, 24 report military provision of humanitarian assistance and disaster response in developing countries in the last 12 years. And they don't note, though, in those data whether they're climate related or not. So we've been researching that to try to add a little bit more analysis to this. But we can see, even just by looking at this snippet of the information of just 4 countries, what a different focus countries have in their disaster-related assistance abroad. So the lighter color for each country is non-climate aid, and the darker country is climate-related aid. And so we can see that Australia, which is in blue, really focuses more on climate aid abroad. Canada, too, which is in green, focuses mostly on climate-related aid, whereas Sweden in red and the UK in orange focus mostly on non-climate related humanitarian assistance. So this is just one small peek at what we're trying to do as sort of the tip of the iceberg. We're still working on getting much more fine-grained data across countries, and again, as I said, seeking to get data from the countries themselves rather than through these varied reporting mechanisms and through international organizations, which start to, aggregate the data in ways where we lose a lot of that information that we really want in knowing if it's climate-related versus not, which countries is it going to, et cetera. So this is where you come in if you're interested in these issues, as I know you all are, and if you have a little bit of spare time, which I know you all don't. We would love for you to be involved just by sharing your country's data or your expertise for us to add to the data set, to the country profiles. A couple of our colleagues are going to be talking with you about international organization profiles they're working on. We also have a resource guide that's aiming to collect other research that's ongoing in this area. So if you're interested to be involved, please follow up with any of us. This is just an overview again of the various partners and our website. We hope that you will stay in contact and we can discuss more in Q&A.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Ashley, are there any other trends or surprises in the data that you've seen so far that you'd want to highlight?
Ooh, I would really point to some of the unique things that we're seeing that countries are doing. I highlighted Brazil. They're very advanced in terms of their thinking around training their military for disaster responses and particularly civil protection. As I said, they've created these dual-use forces that are now, since I believe 2014, present in every regional unit that have specialized training across the board in civil protection activities. What's interesting, though, in that setup, and our colleague there in the Brazilian military has really pointed out, the country has a very extensive legal framework guiding the military's role in these areas, but it's mostly focused on environmental issues and not wholly specific yet to climate-related responses. So it's just interesting to see some of the nuances emerging even within one country that is very focused on specializing the training for its forces. So hopefully we'll be learning some interesting lessons.
Are there any other novel approaches that militaries are taking to respond to climate-related emergencies you'd like to highlight?
I would point to some of the training approaches that we've seen. For example, in France and Spain, they both have permanent schools set up to train the military. In Spain, it's only for the military. In France, it's for military and civilian officials and those engaged in civil protection, which is, one way to be focusing training sort of year-round on specializing the skills of the force.
Great. And you did outline some of the deliverables that CASA is going to produce. I wonder if you could just give us the place where people could go if they want more information about CASA.
Yes, definitely. So our website is project-casa.org. So
great.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Jessica.
Yeah, I'm going to be quite quick, I think, with the caveat that I am not speaking for the U.S. government or the U.S. Navy. I am an analyst and a generalist, so I'm going to talk about the U.S. Broadly in this space. As you've heard about, the U.S. security and defense apparatus has been thinking about climate as a security threat since the early 2000s. It's evolved and it's shifted shape over time, given different administrations' priorities. The first DoD climate roadmap was actually in 2014, and then it's shifted again, as Allison mentioned earlier, with the Biden administration issuing an executive order 14008. It galvanized the entire power of the U.S. federal government to really focus on climate change in both its foreign and domestic policy. So what you saw in response to that is 30 U.S. government agencies, including the Department of Defense, issuing climate plans. So some of them cover adaptation more than mitigation, but they all speak to their own equities in that space. So DoD itself has a climate plan. All of the service branches have one. Shout out to the Army, who was the first out the gate with their climate plan, as well as the only service branch with an actual implementation plan to said strategy. So hats off to you. I know, Allison, you did that personally. So I'm teasing there. So there's a lot of activity already happening in this space. And even though it has shifted shape over the past several years, there's a lot of really cool activities happening. Of course, it doesn't negate the fact for additional mitigation actions that are needed. But if you have any interest in these things, I can talk about them more at length, specifically as it relates to energy, environment, and installations. And those are typically the offices within the Department of Defense that handle these things. The Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, so the REPI program, or the Defense Community Infrastructure Pilot Program, the DCIP program, those are typically funded pretty robustly. And those are existing programs that are public-private partnerships that do land conservation, prevent against encroachment issues. They try to shore up the installations. Many folks don't know that the installations are actually tied to the commercial grid. So you're relying on the grid around the installation for your installation's power. So there's a symbiotic relationship there, both for energy security and sort of inherent climate resilience in those conversations. So I can talk more about that, but I won't anchor on it here because there are a couple of other things I want to highlight. And that is something that Lieutenant Colonel Burbridge was talking about earlier today, and I'm sure Lieutenant Colonel Kirk will also highlight it. These conversations within the Department of Defense have to be led first with mission assurance. And I think, I wish Dr. Kimbrell was still here because I think we would have a lively conversation about the existential question that we have if we're using military forces for non-combat things more and more frequently, right? If you're using a military force, they're typically trained to go fight win, right? Not necessarily, feed babies. Or as in the case in the US, some of the National Guard units are actually filling in teaching positions. So what does that mean? What kinds of different trainings do you need? Are you equipped to do that? And a short anecdote, if you'll indulge me. I won't mention the service branch, but we were on a mission. We were in Turkey, and we were trying to get something done. And this particular officer was adamant that we pushed through the Friday. And the partner nation was very offended by that because they needed time for their Friday prayers. And the U.S. officer was adamant that we not break for that. And so there's a cultural sensitivity that comes with these things. There's an awareness of these things. There's a different set of skills that are fundamentally needed in that I think really needs to be discussed. And then the last thing I'll say is just to throw some data at you in terms of the tactical and operational implications of what the premise of this is, right? Which is that climate change is increasing extreme weather in intensity and frequency. From fiscal year 2016 to 2021, the number of personnel days the National Guard Bureau spent fighting fires went from 14,000 to 176,000. 14,000 to 176,000 in 5 years. That is incredible. Think about that for a minute. Think about what that does to your manpower, to your burn and turn, to your procurement needs, to your uniforms, to how the care and feeding of the soldiers. There's a human factor here as well for the soldiers that are taking this on. There's so much more I could say about this, but I think I'll stop there and cede the floor.
Just following up on that, is the increase in person days devoted to fighting fires a function of more fires, or is it a function of a greater willingness to use the National Guard to fight fires? All of the above?
So I can't say specifically. National Guard units are typically under the command of the governors of each of the states, unless the U.S. government does a federalization. So one of the things that we're trying to get to with Project CASA is to actually get the answer to those questions. So some of the data is there, some of the data is not there. And asking those questions and then actually trying to find that data is a question that we're trying to answer.
Right, great. In some of our previous discussions, you mentioned the U.S. response during Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 as a really interesting case study. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
Absolutely. So if you recall, 2017 was a particularly aggressive severe weather year for hurricanes. And by the way, the University of Colorado has just issued its forecast. I think it was 23 named storms, 11 11 hurricanes and 5 significant storms are what they're predicting. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration will issue their predictions next month. So I don't think it's any surprise to anybody in this room. Ocean waters are extremely warm right now. We've had an extremely warm February and a warm March, coming off of a record-setting 2023. So we're sort of girding our loins there as we go into this. So I won't get too into the specifics, but in the United States, if you're responding to a domestic emergency, you have a different lever of authorities. So you have defense support, what's called defense support to civil authorities, or DSCA. If you are activated for something abroad, it is typically done through USAID. So in the case of Irma and Maria, that was a Cat 5 hurricane that came through the Caribbean, not sure how you say it. So you actually had Northcom assets under tactical control or control coordinating with FEMA, which is our Federal Emergency Management Agency. And then you had Southcom assets, the Southern Command assets, actually reporting to USAID and doing some of that work. And just as an illustration, I happen to have the notes here, fortunately. Again, to think through what that really means, one HSC helicopter pilot, flew 112 hours in 1 month, and that is 3 times what he normally flies during a deployment. Again, think about that. That impacts your maintenance cycle for the aircraft. That impacts his rest time. There are second and third order effects that we really are just scratching the surface of with Project CASA and with this research and the data that we're trying to collect.
Great. What do you think your research is showing to be the most important elements of civil-military cooperation in climate-related emergencies? What do you think the data is telling you so far?
It's going to get worse. You know, the U.S. military is extremely proficient. They will do what they're needed to do when they need to do it. They're particularly adept in initial responses to these kinds of emergencies. The helicopter rotary wing action is very, very important. But I think the communication piece is probably obviously one of the most important, both within the units themselves and understanding how climate is going to be impacting their jobs, as well as communication with the community. And that's something that I actually do in my day job at the American Security Project. We actually travel around the United States talking about climate change. We convene forums like this and talk to people like my grandma and try to help to connect the dots, because I don't think people have a full appreciation for what's in store.
Do you help them connect the dots with possible military response to a disaster in their area?
Yeah, sure. So we talk about it. We typically do them. I will highlight Florida because we have a special line of programming for Florida. Florida has 20 military installations, including 3 commands. So it's CENTCOM, Central Command, Southcom, Southern Command, and Special Operations Command. And Florida, Miami in particular, is sort of the poster child. This is way longer than 6 minutes. I'm sorry. Miami is sort of the poster child for climate change in the U.S., but they're also doing incredibly innovative work down there in terms of wastewater management and all kinds of resilience efforts. So when we do activities in Florida, what we do is we convene a forum like this. We bring in either a retired military officer who can speak a little bit more freely than someone in uniform, and then we bring in whoever we can get in terms of community stakeholders. So whether that's a professor or a city councilor or a mayor or the FEMA regional director, whoever we can, and we really tailor those conversations to whatever the hazard is. So, for example, in Florida, we would talk about saltwater intrusion, whereas in Arizona, we were talking about extreme heat, right? So there's a range of things that I'm happy to talk about, but I've talked too long.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, why don't we turn our attention to Libby and Rebecca.
So, hello everyone. Before we begin, on behalf of Rebecca and myself, we really want to thank you all for having us at this conference. We've learned so much over the past 2 days and are honored that you would allow 2 lowly master's students to present our research. So the CASA project focuses on assessing national military resources and their ability to prepare for and respond to climate-related emergencies. Although acknowledging this is important, we have taken this research a step further by considering the challenges and issues of international humanitarian organizations working alongside national and foreign military forces in responding to climate-related disaster emergencies. These humanitarian actors include NGOs such as the Red Cross, UN branches such as the UNHCR, and the International Agency Standing Committee. For a project for Global Affairs Canada, we are also exploring the implications of our findings for Canada, hoping to suggest ways that the state can address some of these challenges that we have identified. So today we are going to share 4 key issues that we would like to share.
So our first one, thank you. Analysis shows there are gaps in military and humanitarian guidelines in international and disaster law. So participating states and humanitarian actors highlight the military to be a tool of last resort in all guidelines and only focus on internationally deployed military assets. This is due to concern that foreign militaries might overstep their boundaries, undermining the state and clashing with the impartiality principle that is crucial to humanitarian actors. As a result, guidelines are unclear about how humanitarian actors should coordinate with each other and military actors when providing climate disaster relief. Currently, there are only 4 non-binding guidelines that steer humanitarian and military response to disaster relief. These include the Oslo Guidelines, the Interagency Standing Committee Reference Paper 2004, the Military and Civil Defense Assets Guideline 2006, and the Interagency Standing Committee Non-Binding Guidelines on the Use of Armed Escorts for Humanitarian Convoys from 2013. These guidelines neglect guidance on how humanitarian actors should work with the police, national militaries, or even private security contractors. And this is important as national militaries can be tasked with being first responders in some state frameworks and policies. Further, ignore the guidelines on how civilian responders engaging with armed actors on negotiating humanitarian access and promoting civil protection. Secondly, local populations' perceptions of foreign and national militaries' involvement may hinder the work of humanitarian actors. So, according to a UN Civil Military Coordination Guide for military involvement in emergency response, local populations may not perceive the difference between military and humanitarian operations. This is especially prevalent under authoritative governments and in conflict, or in other words, in complex emergencies. Therefore, due to local distrust against military actors, both national and international, the humanitarian operating environment can critically shrink and can even lead to suspensions of humanitarian operations due to consequential security concerns. And this, of course, places affected populations at risk. So there's been little research conducted on whether these UN assumptions do hold true, yet it is a problem discussed in the public health sector, with locals reported to be reluctant to accept military healthcare in epidemics. This is something that we are actively researching. However, alternative methods of protecting humanitarian actors has been reported to have affected their ability to reach populations due to local apprehensions towards the enlisted security sources. For instance, while providing assistance in Somalia for famine and drought relief in 2011, aid workers are being kidnapped and violently targeted by armed actors of the Al-Shabaab military and political organization in the south and central parts of the country. Humanitarian organizations were prevented from enlisting the protection from foreign and national military organizations because of Al-Shabaab's violence towards these intruding military actors. So humanitarian organizations instead relied on private security companies that were unintentionally actually run by local warlords, and the adoption of security tactics such as fortification. And this increased securitization led to a divide between international humanitarian workers and local actors, which created negative local perceptions towards international humanitarian action.
Thirdly, there is a difference in coordinating and information sharing priorities between international organizations and militaries. The leadership and coordination structures of humanitarian organizations are consensus-based, which is different to the command and control structures of military organizations. A humanitarian representative may not be in a position to make immediate commitments or talk for other humanitarian actors. The Interagency Standing Committee tries to solve these issues by providing hierarchical structures for NGOs and UN branches to coordinate. However, it often neglects to include the foreign and national military in decision-making and coordination. Moreover, it was reported in a country-level interview in 2022 Humanitarian Policy Group Independent Review that there was a lack of appropriate forums for national governments and humanitarian actors to coordinate in the Interagency Standing Committee. Therefore, more work needs to be done to either include these actors within the committee or create a new international coordination structure to fill this gap. This issue of incompatibility of structure and culture is something that has come up often in interviews of both military and humanitarian actors. Swedish government project officers from the Department of National Defense responding to Pakistan's floods in 2012 noted that humanitarian actors sent low-ranking professionals to coordination meetings, which they argued sent a message to foreign military actors that the coordination meetings were not very important. It is uncertain if the reason for sending juniors was due to the distrust and unwillingness to work with foreign military actors, or because neither side was clear on the leadership or structures of each other's role. While military organizations are often opaque with operational information, international organizations can also be reluctant to share information. This is due to fear that military involvement may lead to the suspension of humanitarian operations for security reasons. As well, the UN Civil Military Coordination Guide for Military Involvement suggests that humanitarian organizations associated with the military and their activities may put aid workers in harm's way. The final challenge we have identified is that the security and strategic position of both sending and receiving countries needs to be considered before allowing the deployment of foreign military forces for climate-related disasters. Much like the military perceptions locally, it is important to consider state and popular perceptions. International military forces responding to climate emergencies are state representatives and are thus perceived differently from international humanitarian organizations acting on non-biased principles. People's attitudes towards foreign military forces responding to climate-related emergencies will affect a state's general attitude toward relations with those foreign states. As previously discussed, states can politicize aid by choosing where to get aid from in order to gain allies and advance political goals. The separation of humanitarian and foreign military actors is a further issue for states in the Horn of Africa. International states have played an increasingly competitive role in the region's political, economic, and security arrangements. Foreign militaries have a role in maintaining economic security, especially in India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE, who have leased over 900,000 hectares of fertile land in Ethiopia to hedge against food security threats in their own societies. In this region, foreign military presence in disaster relief is contentious for some scholars because they claim that governments misuse disasters in order to justify granting the military a greater role in civilian affairs. As a result, the motives of civil-military coordination is challenged because it is argued that foreign military intervention in disaster relief jeopardizes humanitarian actors who wish to maintain impartiality. Further, a state's decision to accept vital foreign military aid is impacted by concerns over their own ability to control their population and resources. In 2011, the Al-Shabaab organization publicly asked for assistance in southern Somalia to aid the drought and famine. Yet a few months later, Al-Shabaab banned 16 UN agencies and international NGOs, accusing them of advocating for secularism and demonstrating a lack of neutrality. Whether humanitarian actors had ulterior motives or not, it has been argued that the increasing blurring of lines between humanitarian actors and military forces creates a barrier for humanitarian actors to reach vulnerable populations in disaster response. There is more research and attention needed on this neglected subject in order to create a coordinated response and protect vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I wonder, this problem of coordination between the military and humanitarian actors seems very difficult to overcome. Do you think responding to climate-related emergencies could kickstart or stimulate better coordination?
Conducting coordination meetings and joint planning and training exercises prior to climate emergencies is definitely a possible solution. The issue is that every disaster is different in scope and demand and political climate, and contending with different military and humanitarian actors. So actually a good model for this pre-planning took place in 2020 when the first anticipatory action framework was created and launched by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And this is before the onset of the monsoon flood in the summer in Bangladesh. And it was sponsored by the Central Emergency Response Fund, and the pre-approved plan actually allowed for the allocation of resources and funding to the International Federation of the Red Cross, the World Food Programme, and the National Military of Bangladesh. And this overcame administration hurdles, and it reached more people in response to the 2020 floods at half the cost compared to that of the previous year of 2019. This framework is being expanded and improved yearly, and its success points to how other anticipatory programs could be used in other areas where there are reoccurring disasters. Moreover, anticipatory planning would help humanitarian actors gain unique military resources, personnel, and protection that can be crucial for life-saving humanitarian assistance, such as through infrastructure support. And also without the negative impact of being associated with military forces.
Great, wonderful. Now, you've both outlined a few difficult coordination challenges regarding militaries working together with international organizations, and I wonder what you think Canada could do to help solve some of these issues. Where are some areas where Canada could, actually make a difference?
Yeah, so we think that Canada can learn from these issues when implementing civil military assistance, whether in Canada or abroad, by maintaining clear and open communication networks between humanitarian actors and the military. It's evident from our research that when there is a lack of communication between groups, it is difficult to coordinate tasks and resources based on their priority of need. Clear guidelines needs to be created and followed for both national and international militaries, as well as humanitarian actors, on how to communicate effectively in order to provide the most effective and efficient aid for people in need. Canada can work to create stronger and more inclusive international coordination structures in international forums, such as through the United Nations. It's also important to note that benefits of regional agreements to create clear communication and action in national emergencies, building contingency plans among strong allies with similar expectations in countries, which is seen in the ASEAN case, is beneficial for overcoming political confidence and security hurdles. Furthermore, Canada can expand the existing coordination that it already has through groups like NATO or the OAS to highlight communication issues between humanitarian organizations and the military. NATO has begun this process through their missions by creating enhanced training and education capabilities with the IFRC and the UN. So NATO is seen as a platform to develop these communication needs.
Great, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Virk, I wonder if you could maybe expand on the Canadian experience based on what you've experienced over the last few years.
So first of all, thank you for having me here, Tom, and Bruno, if he's still in the room somewhere. Anyways, it's a pleasure to be here and to hear everyone speak so far. It's actually been quite enlightening. I would say I'll take one of my favorite cultural case study books called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In it, there's a slug. You put the slug in your ear. You let it hear some words, and it translates for you. So I'm going to give you a couple of words that I took from the rest of you today and yesterday that I heard. Adaptation, mitigation, interoperability, operational effectiveness, and the power of information, plus prevent and respond. My takeaway from these words is that these are all action items. And it's very powerful and enlightening for me to hear that the community is actually speaking about action and not just the problem itself. So I think that it's powerful to hear that we're moving towards a direction that's going on to that. Today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my specific involvement. I'm not a studier of a lot of this to the depths that we've heard here, but I'm more of the practitioner, and I'm at the bottom end of all the research that you're doing, and the operations side of it is how it goes. I'm going to give you some numbers. Tom, if you can remind me at the very end to just tell you what these numbers mean. 98, 2, 13, 5, and 52. No, it's not the Lotto Super Bowl, but I will come back to what those represent at the very end. Operation Lentis. Okay, what is Operation Lentis? That is Canadian Armed Forces naming convention for any natural disaster involvement that it has. In 2023, there were 8 operations that we were involved in. How it works in Canada for involvement on domestic operations is it's a bottom-up approach. So our municipalities, they try to deal with a situation for a natural disaster at the local level, and when they're no longer able to deal with it, they request up to the provincial level or the territorial level. And the territory and provincial will then bring their resources to bear and try to provide the support that's necessary to deal with the disaster, all throughout a whole of government approach at each one of the levels. When the province is unable to deal with the situation within its capacities, it then goes to the federal government for support. That is triggered by what's called an RFA, or a request for assistance. It's a formal letter written by the Premier or the Minister of Emergency Management in whatever province into Public Safety Canada, who then internally looks at federal agencies to determine what is the best solution of what resources to go out there. And in all of these operations, the CAF were a key component, Canadian Armed Forces were a key component in being deployed out to that. Once it moves into the Canadian Armed Forces, we internally, what the Army is very good at is having a lot of structure, okay? If you want bureaucracy, you come into the military and you will find it in droves. We have layers and layers, and most of it is built upon contingencies. So in Canada, we have joint task forces. There's one in the Pacific region, there's one in the West, North, Central Canada, and the Atlantic region. Each one of these geographical locations have a headquarters that are there for natural disasters. They do not have resources attached to them, but they have the sort of the command component structures ready to be able to deal with a scenario. So when a disaster happens within their region, resources from Lloyd's Institution over there from CJOC cut them over from wherever they need to be, the force package based on the province, then we are sent over to that agency and then sort of report to it. So in this case, in 23, I was the 8th and last and final one going out for that year. I was cut over to JTFP for the province of BC. Okay. Can we go to the next slide? It's not rotating on its own. Okay, thank you. Perfect. Originally, we were supposed to be moving out to an area that's called Kelowna. It's about 400 kilometers east of Vancouver. For those of you who are in Canada or in the western part of the Pacific Northwest, you probably would have heard about the fires that were happening in the Kelowna region. That area is the 3rd largest population center within Canada, within province of British Columbia. And the BC Wildfire Services were feeling really drained out from an extremely difficult year of firefighting services. So they had started repositioning their resources to come deal with West Kelowna, but it was potentially going to get a lot larger. They had been fighting fires in the north all early summer. They had moved to the south, and then they had said, okay, button pushed, we need some military support. As we're tasked to start moving out, resources were compiled from across 4 provinces to come in to support, to make a land task force, which I commanded, to bring together to help support them. As we're driving through from these 4 provinces all together, I receive a phone call from the province. Province goes, I don't need you in Kelowna. We are anticipating weather conditions to change in 48 hours in the north, and we pulled everything out and we can't get back there fast enough. Can you get there? So, job changes. We move into Kelowna, then we turn around and we do what is the equivalent of driving from Paris to Berlin. And then we move up into that region, which is a little over 1,000 kilometers, enter into Prince George, and then my AO is basically the size of Belgium, okay? Approximately a little bit, to cover off with 150 soldiers to address fires that are spread out into multiple areas. Moving in from what was originally supposed to be a suburban type fire location, a very large interface, whereas it's infecting infrastructure and people, into a much more rural location, a very remote location, but still affecting individuals and industry as well into those areas, which include mining and forestry into those areas that are the livelihoods for that. And I think this is one key takeaway that people should remember, is that the emergency at the moment may be the fire, but the emergency for the people is their livelihoods after the event. The military is brought in to deal with that current emergency to try to sort of mitigate it. But if it doesn't mitigate in the whole of government approach properly, then you may have saved a town for no reason, because it has no reason to exist if everything is gone that had gone down from there. So there are these dynamics that need to be understood, and how do you understand what you're supposed to do? The key component here is the military is not the leader of the plan or the action for us in Canada. We are the last in, first out, in support to another agency. And in this case, we were in support to BC Wildfire Services. And so a lot of liaison has to occur at that point. There are multiple layers of liaison occurring at the provincial and federal levels, but the tactical and operational liaison is occurring by the force command that's happening on the ground at the time. So I, as having a bit of a CIMIC background, which is civil military cooperation, which is actually a secondary role task within the Canadian Army, deploy forward what are called liaison officers to multiple locations. I myself can't sit 400 kilometers apart for all the meetings that are taking in every location, so I need to move people and individuals into different locations. The province is huge. It's managed Prince George, but there's also Kamloops Fire Center 800 kilometers away, which is giving resources to this fire into the north. So you have to then also provide sort of some liaison function into that area to see what they need and what you need from them. Interoperability aspects that you brought out, and actually two of your issues there actually were really key that came in information sharing. I relied a lot upon what the information is the BC Wildfire Services had. How do we engage into their infrastructure network for their information that doesn't align with the military one? It's hard enough for NATO to figure out military to military, let alone military to civilian, let alone military to private industry and so forth. So then this is where liaison and relationship building is very key to understand in advance what you're going to be falling into, what radios they're using, what radios we're using, and so forth. Fighting fires, we do a level 3 live fire, which you see on the screen right now, which is basically like mop-up hotspots, making sure a fire doesn't come back into a region that it's just sort of gone through, freeing up their more specialty skill individuals to go fight the frontline level 1 type 1 fires. That aspect of doing that work is very vital, but I would say in many domestic operations at a command level, your two top priorities are communication and logistics. Okay. Without that communication and logistics, you are going to have a breakdown of efficiencies of efforts, because natural disasters inherently are always bigger than the resources that can be brought to bear to them, no matter how many resources you bring. The size of the fires that were occurring in the province or within Canada last year was never seen to that level for the number of acres and that were covered off. You were counting them in the thousands of kilometers, right? For forests that were burnt down. So you can't deal with all the fires, you have to deal with whatever is the specific components. Liaison is also more of a function, and in the previous panel it was quite interesting to hear. Liaison, I would say, on the agency aspect of it is vital to understand how people live. We were going to remote locations where people were homesteading. They weren't even supposed to be living there. It had been under an evacuation alert or order, which means they had to have left the area a month in advance, because this is the second time fires came through. People don't want to leave their homes. And it doesn't mean that they're just being obnoxious. They have nowhere to go. This is their only form of living and life. And they feel that they need to be the ones taking care of their place, right? It is their home. So when you are going into a location, even if you think you're knowing right and you want to evacuate someone from a location, you have to understand the dynamics they're coming from, right? Otherwise, you'll make a larger situation. My liaison officers were giving me a lot of warning signals, BC Wildfire, a lot of warning signals to be prepared for a little bit of a cold shoulder when you go up to the north, right? Because they don't want to be pulled out of their region. So in those situations, this is where your agency relationship is very important to understand. You put the right people in the right place. You change maybe leadership or someone who can speak properly so you don't run into the situation that you ran over there. They are the ones who can communicate what you're doing when you're coming in. Because if you come in, it's their perception, not your reality, that matters. And at that point, it changes the dynamic of what your role is supposed to be, and it just makes it harder instead of easier. Great situation in the sense that we were able to embed within the community. They were living side by side. It was so remote that we were sharing their Starlink until my services got up, and then they were sharing my Starlink, and I was given in the water. Not the ideal scenario you want to see about militaries always interacting with civilians, because I will have to leave first, as I mentioned, right? And leaving first changes the dynamic of the psyche of the individuals on the ground, because they sense a sense of relief when they see a uniform. But is that relief, is that stability there for you when you leave? Because it's not your call to leave. It is then again the province's call if they have other resources to come in. So there are all these personal dynamics that come into play when doing domestic operations that you don't think are initially related to climate, but climate has been the trigger that required you to be out in there.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned people expressing a sense of relief when they saw your uniform. Did you ever come across a situation where they didn't seem relieved to see you?
In 23, no, it was pretty good. In 2018, yes. Certain communities have either they have a propensity to want to really be appreciative of the government or the military, and others have a much more colder approach in the sense they want you to prove that you're there for the right reasons. And First Nations communities have quite a wide dynamic of what is going on in each one of those communities, and it's trying to understand what is their perceptions and stereotypes of you before you arrive versus the other way around. And that is really important to be able to come in there early before you show up with all the cavalry per se. To explain what the situation is. It's not always a win situation, but it definitely is dynamic, and so it's not.
So in the Canadian context, with
First Nations having a mixed relationship with the Canadian government over many decades, it's a tricky situation to be able to establish a state-to-nation relationship in those kinds of cases.
Yeah, I would say it's very sensitive, at least in my eyes, about how do you approach it. In 23, there's a place called Whitefish Lake. Has one single road to it, goes for 18 kilometers, had burnt down and the power lines went off it. So power lines are on roads too as well. So you have like their multi-purpose, what a road is, leads to the First Nations band. It's the only way in and out, burnt down twice throughout the course of the summer. It's sensitive in our eyes because like these people have been evacuated 3 times. Are they going to evacuate a 4th time? And every time they come in and out, they can't work. So now they have been out of work for a month, right? Building that relationship with that community allowed us to have, I would say, positive goodwill in advance for it, but it's something you need to explore and understand before you make an action sometimes.
Right, right. Now, what about those numbers you
yes.
listed?
So I'm a data-driven guy. I love having dashboards and whatnot, but sometimes they don't always paint the wondrous pictures. 98 current fires in BC as we speak right now. 2, the number of fires that have started in the last 24 hours. 13 evacuation orders and alerts currently undergoing there. 5 states of local emergency and 52 band council resolutions, First Nation resolutions for the similar thing. It shows you that it doesn't matter where the seasons are, that we are expecting this year to be almost no different than last year. And it's not always the fires themselves that are the issue, but it's the resource capacity. So why was the 8th one went in? Why did they need me? They said we need leadership and we need structure. My teams are tired, right? And this is something we're going to see a lot more as we move forward if the current structures aren't changed or addressed, and it will have an effect on a variety of trickle effects in the community. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Finally, I'd like to turn it over to Alexandrine.
I'm not sure how I feel about having the burden of the last presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here today. Thanks to Bruno. The topics of climate security is quite new for me since my organization focused on civil climate adaptation needs mostly here in Quebec. So my presentation will be touching the topics of the last panel and this one. And when Bruno proposed me to speak, I wasn't quite sure what to present. I have nothing but everything to tell you today. So as I understand, and as we talked since yesterday, we are all facing similar challenges, and we need to learn from each other's. So in that order, I think I will start by presenting who we are, who Ouranos is, because it could underline some of a question we have since 2 days. We are a research consortium on climate change adaptation and also described as a boundary organization. We are born in the aftermath of the 1996 flood here in Quebec and also the 1998 ice storm by the joint will of provincial and federal government. We have universities member as well as ministries, hydropower companies, and most recently cities such as Montreal as member, but we also work with different other, with people outside of our members with a broad network of more than 400 experts. As Shannon Burke introduced yesterday, the need to fill the gap between research and practitioners, Ouranos is trying to bridge that gap by being a boundary organization. So our goal is to ensure complementarity between science and society needs to efficiently adapt to climate change, analyze and assess science-based solution in order to help organizations and stakeholders make informed adaptation decisions. And we also offer an innovative approach that actively engage a broad network of researchers, expert practitioners, and decision makers. So we work along the whole continuum from climate science. So we have climate science teams that work in climate with the regional climate model. And we go all the way through the adaptation and decision making. It's almost unique since organizations like us tends to focus more on the climate science or on the adaptation science, and we work everyone together in our organization. We work along, our approach aims effective adaptation, and our service offer is declined around 6 main services, which are climate change expertise and advice. We also have technical and financial support for research and development. My teams is mostly working on integration of issues, knowledge, and stakeholders. And also we have a whole team who is working on stakeholder and knowledge mobilization and also on enhanced dissemination and transfer of research and development results. So we really try to well communicate it and in the good language the result of our research to make sure we target the right public. We also offer support for climate change adaptation actors such as government. So our main focus is the regional level. I'm not sure if I have the good word on regional level, but we are mainly focusing on the Quebec province, but we also work at the national scales and also at the international scales to be sure that we enable to be sure we are able to reach as many stakeholders as possible, but also to learn from many expertise as possible. Our audience is diverse, but we work mostly with decision makers, academics, and practitioners, like I said before. On the adaptation side, our program focuses on 8 different adaptation priorities that reflect the main challenges for Quebec society. I'm not sure if you can read it, but we have one program on economy, another one on energy security, one on water availability, one on food systems, another one on health, social health challenges. The one I'm leading is on reducing risk of extreme events. We have one in living environment, so the whole concept of living environments. And the other one that could be also interesting for you, it's the one on the climate change, the adaptation governance. So this was how we work, but now I would like to take a time to present what our works told us about the futures for Quebec, what we can expect regarding climate change here in Quebec. But most of the information I will present could be also regarding the national level. So I'll be quick on the next slide because probably all of you are already familiar with these figures, but I'd like to especially bring your attention to the yellow part of the figure, where we can see that no matter which path we are taking and how we mitigate climate change, mitigate green gas emission, the climate is already changing and will continue to change at least until 2040. So that highlights the needs for adaptation. For Quebec, this global change will result in seasonal change in climate pattern where temperature and precipitation will be higher and extreme more present. It will also says that winter will be less intense and snow coverage less abundant for the southern part of Quebec, but also for the northern part of Quebec. In other terms, Quebec will face shock and stresses. As an example, for extreme events, for shocks, a study shows that we will expect more frequent and intense wildfire, as we just talked about, where burnt area could be increasing by 2 to 4 times by the end of the century. So more need for the military to help us prevent those fires. We also know that the maximum annual flood could increase from 3 to 15% regarding the 2081 to 2010 period. If for those who don't know, we experienced 2 major floods, one in 2017 and one in 2019, that reshaped the whole policies regarding flood managing here in Quebec. We could also think of water shortage that will increase for southern part of Quebec. That could have considerable impact on population, but also on economic sectors such as agriculture or water-consuming industries. This will lead to the need of prioritize activities that could access the resources. For the stress part, that we could also consider as the subtitle and long-term but also permanent change, we know that they are reshaping the normality and could be the bigger trigger to conflict for the future. So all those biophysical changes result from climate change will have cascading effects on social, environmental, political and economic aspects of Quebec society. Those impacts are very different from north to south and east to west part of the province, underlining the complexity in which we have to work to address those adaptation challenges. So I'll be very short on all those regions, but the north is warming faster than the south. The impact are major, but also we have to deal with little establishment, vulnerable population, cultural tradition and difficulty to access. For the resources region, the middle part of Quebec, the impact are mostly on ecosystems and economy. Even if this region is not well populated, the challenges on this region could have a huge impact on population locally and globally. For example, we could think of the wood price following a wildfire or the diplomacy issues with the US following a power outage caused by wildfire. The coastal region is probably the most vulnerable region facing climate change. The infrastructure are very vulnerable as well as the economy, who is especially depending on tourism and fisheries, who are very vulnerable to climate change. And the last part, the southern part of Quebec, is the most popular part, as you know. The impact are basically on health and health system, economy and infrastructure, but we also have to deal with several, as you all talked since yesterday, we also have to deal with several other challenges than climate change that makes adaptation more complex. So in addition to the impacts of climate change directly affect Quebec, we're also becoming more and more aware of the impacts experienced on a global scale that could also affect us. I think you're probably more familiar with those issues than me. So we're starting to think about those challenges. So regarding all those issues, what we could do, we have to be more proactive and invest in adaptation. We have to educate our leaders that if we act now in prevention, we will save a long term, especially when we know that climate is already changing and will continue for the next decade, no matter our action in mitigation. And how we do, it's certainly by working together, and maybe I think it's why I'm here also today, to see that we have to work with the military and with the civil organization to tackle this issue. We have to share our knowledge, like today. We have to collaborate, and we have to coordinate our action. I'll go very quick on how Uranus works could be helpful for the military, the climate security challenges. I'll present some of our work that we do with our partners. The example that I will show cover a wide range of subjects we cover, and I took some of examples that could be really helpful for you. So this is 6 projects that tackle different issues that could be interesting. We work with the CCC, so the Standard Council of Canada, to integrate climate change resilience in infrastructure code. We work on social impact of climate change and how we could be more prepared to act with the most vulnerable. For example, we also collaborate on a Canadian study that was assessing the impact of climate change on the health of workers. We work on evaluate the impact of climate change on the potential of hydropower. We mainly work with Hydro-Québec to assess the impact of the climate change on their assets, but also on the production and the capacity of production in the changing climate and distribution. But we also had interest in the potential of other kind of energy, such as the wind power in the context of climate change. It's not only issues, but we also have opportunities in the context of climate change. So that's one of those projects we did.
1 minute, please, Alexandra.
Yeah, I'll be quick. And so following the 2023 wildfire, we start a new initiative with a different range of partners. We have ministries, agencies, industries, indigenous communities, and different academic partners on a cost-benefit analysis of adaptation solution for wildfire. We previously done 2 other major studies on cost-benefit analysis, one for the coastal region and one for flooding, that led to some action at the government level. So with these studies, among the costs we will be assessed, they are those linked to the emergency management, example, the deployment of the army, the evacuation, but also the impact on infrastructure, the loss of economic activities like the profitability of forests, the health regarding the air pollution here in Montreal, and even indirect costs linked to the loss of biodiversity or cultural heritage. So this study aims to raise awareness among decision makers that investing in adaptation, to show them that investing in adaptation, it could be a benefit. We also have another initiative that could be interesting for you. It's a very local initiative. It's a living lab on equity regarding adaptation. But the main goal is to study and experience potential inequities related to climate change adaptation. Since inequities can lead to crisis, I was thinking that could be an interesting project, and it's kind of a new approach we're tackling with this project. We also, as I said before, we intend to expand our focus and explore what could be the international dimension of adaptation for Quebec. So in January, we host a workshop in that topics with different experts across Canada, and these are the main subject that comes from this workshop. And now we're trying to explore what could be the next steps on those topics. So everything I present is available on our website. We have a lot more projects if you are interested. And we also have different, and we contribute to different climate platform. I haven't focused on that, but we have our own platform, but we also work closely with ECCC, so Environmental and Climate Change Canada, on their platforms, and also with the Quebec government on the l'Atlas hydroclimatique, which leads to the flood mapping here in Quebec. And for those who are more on the engineering side, we have Pavix, which is online platform where you can like do your own climate projection. So that's it.
All right. Well, on behalf of CSAC, I would like to thank our panelists for a really interesting and excellent panel, and thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you. I promise we'll be brief, just in some words of conclusion. But before I do conclude and close the thing, I want to give a few minutes to our friends from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. Axel Umbach is coming from Paris, and as always from the section on political affairs and democratic governance. I just translated it on the spot. As I was saying yesterday, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie has been supporting the Centre Franco-Père de Charles-Hollande since its beginning in 2016. And so they've been very supportive of what me and the team has been trying to do, which involves all sorts of things. I won't get into that, but also the turn, or if I can call it that, into climate change and what that implies for all sorts of things, as we've been discussing for 2 days. So I wanted to thank him and the people over there and give them the floor a little bit to just talk about them, basically. Axel.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Charbonneau. Mr. Director of the Franco-Père Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace Missions, dear Mr. Charbonneau, dear partners, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the world is in a state of climate emergency. This is a persistent danger exposing us to increasing security risks. Solutions to climate change are no longer optional, neither for our states and governments nor for our populations, already weakened by other endogenous factors. They have become imperatives to mitigate increasingly intense and unforeseen consequences. We must react and anticipate these consequences. This is the mindset that the International Organization of la Francophonie, OIF, has promoted among its French-speaking strategic research and analysis partners. Our organization collaborates with several research centers to develop Francophone strategic thinking and research in order to connect the world of knowledge with decision-making. The scientific work supported by the OIF helps to inform political decisions and actions on the ground, ensuring better responses to the needs of populations. I would like to mention our partnership with the Franco-Père Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace Missions, which I thank for its contribution to the organization of this conference. The Franco-Père Center has been a long-standing partner of the OIF, with whom we have implemented projects to support strategic research, reflection, and analysis in French in the fields of international peace and security. These activities significantly contribute to enhance the OIF capacity for prevention and early warning. This was the case with the roundtable on the challenges of climate change, on conflict management and resolution that we jointly organized in last April in Paris. Ladies and gentlemen, let me continue in French, please. Mesdames et messieurs, le colloque sur la sécurité climatique et ses défis auxquels nous venons d'assister depuis 2 jours s'inscrit en droite ligne des activités de l'Institut de la Francophonie pour le développement durable, l'IFDD, et de la direction des affaires politiques et de la gouvernance démocratique de l'OIF, à laquelle j'appartiens. Nous menons donc conjointement avec d'autres partenaires, y compris Franco-Père, et d'autres encore, j'espère. On a ici aujourd'hui l'OTAN, le Centre, l'Association pour la sécurité climatique, l'Association canadienne pour la sécurité climatique, le Centre d'excellence de l'OTAN, et d'autres encore, vous tous ici qui êtes experts de la question. Vous êtes autant de forces vives qui permettent de porter des travaux, notamment sur le nexus climat, sécurité et environnement. L'OIF continuera, vous l'aurez compris, à œuvrer davantage à vos côtés, avec vous, contre le changement climatique, en mettant en avant notamment la prévention des crises et des conflits dans l'espace francophone. Cela passe notamment par l'établissement de partenariats avec les centres de recherche. On en a beaucoup parlé, la question de dialoguer encore plus, de créer des ponts entre le monde de la science, le monde de la recherche et puis celui de la prise de décision pour que les décisions soient adaptées aux réalités du terrain et pas décorrélées, pour, in fine, servir les populations. Parce que je pense que le but de tout ce que nous faisons aussi ici, c'est de faire en sorte que tout le monde soit bien. Et donc, je vous le disais, ceci passe par l'établissement de partenariats avec les centres de recherche, dans le but de renforcer la production intellectuelle. J'ai envie de dire en français aussi, on a beaucoup travaillé en anglais. Et dans le but également de construire, je vous le disais, des ponts entre le monde scientifique et les sphères décisionnelles. Donc, une fois de plus, j'exprime notre gratitude envers le Centre Franco-Paix. Notre gratitude va également à l'Association canadienne pour la sécurité climatique, pour l'organisation de la conférence, qui par ailleurs contribue à atteindre les objectifs que j'ai cités précédemment. Je salue à cet égard, vous me le permettrez, la mobilisation de toutes et tous pendant ces 2 jours de travaux, qui, je l'espère, ont été aussi enrichissants pour nous, pour vous, qui l'ont été pour moi et pour mes collègues qui nous suivent en ligne. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Axel. The French part of it is part of the Franco-Paix mission, by the way, which is to bridge, when I launched it on the mission, as we defined it, was was part of the realization that in the things I was working on, which was conflict analysis intervention, the literature in French was fairly small and very French focused. And I was always getting emails from Africa, for instance, trying to find alternatives to going to Paris, for instance. And that's not to say anything against, obviously, French university. I have all sorts of great colleagues there, and some of them are here, obviously. But that was to expand that sort of a relationship and networks. And that speaks also to the questions and issues that we've raised earlier about production of knowledge and different worlds and perspective, and language is an issue. I think that's certainly a part of these issues. Okay, so in terms of conclusion, apologies for that, but I think it is definitely relevant when you talk about production of knowledge and whose climate security are we talking about. Anyway, just 2 quick things to conclude. One, I know if I read the room right and everyone that's been telling me about this is already a success. I had a great time over the last 2 days. Thank you so much for that. And I don't know if I probably speak for Tom and Gabrielle. Apologies, but when we had that crazy, stupid, weird, great idea to launch the association, never thought that would get this interesting and bring so many people from all sorts of backgrounds and so much enthusiasm as well, so quickly, so rapidly. So I am very proud of it, but also very thankful for it, and somehow slightly overwhelmed as well, because I now have more work to do, and we have more work to do. So, saying that, yes, if we do rely also on you and the community to go beyond what we've done today, right? So if you want to get involved, we are solely open for business, whether it's by volunteer on whatever you want to do, like mentoring our students, a fellowship. If it's just opening, again, new avenues of research, collaboration, or whatever, please do reach out. Even if it only means also promoting our stuff online, like through social media, that's always helpful because it expands, obviously it spreads the word. We're only on LinkedIn, and we have a website. We don't have Twitter or whatever it's called these days. But we are on LinkedIn, and you can promote it everywhere. So if you want to follow that. Last year we talked about having a membership, and we sort of decided not to go down that road right now because it's too complicated and too formal. So for now, we'll just stick to trying to figure out where it goes and be a bit less formal. But you know, if you want to follow and be sure to know what we're doing, Lincoln, and we're also hoping to have a monthly newsletter sometime, maybe starting in June or at the latest in the fall. And that also will probably need your help to feed it, because we'll need the content, obviously, and that's one other way in which you can participate. So yeah, so look forward for more events. We're certainly working on consolidating the fellowship program as well. So if you know of ways of always securing, you know, in Canada certainly, funding is always le nerf de la guerre. How do you translate that? Sorry. But you know, you need funding obviously for these sort of things. So especially if it comes for students, that's always helpful. So I think I've covered all I wanted to say about CSAC. Do you want to add something? That's our vice president, by the way. We haven't found a title for Gabriel. That's our mission. We have to.
Other than that, we're looking for people also to join, to help us on running the organization.
Absolutely.
So if you're interested, please feel free to talk to us. And thank you all for participating and coming. Really appreciate your contributions over the last 2 days.
Well, that was my second and last point. Thank you, everyone. So thankful for you all, not only obviously the team, cher Raoul Landurand, without which we cannot have this, the support there, the partnership we have with them. Obviously, I have a special relationship with them, given Francopé, CSAC team, but all of you for being here over 2 days. Some of you are staying for another couple of days. That's great. But without your contribution, enthusiasm, your papers, this cannot happen either. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.